The wind howled through the cracks in the old stone church, bearing the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves from the graveyard beyond. Reverend Elias Rawlins sat at his desk in the vestry, the single candle's flame flickering like a hesitant heartbeat. It was just past 11, the hour when the living world seemed to hold its breath, and the dead whispered secrets to the night. Elias adjusted his spectacles, peering at the ledger before him, names of the departed, their sins confessed in life, or so he had thought. But tonight, the air felt heavier, laced with an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones despite the woolen shawl draped over his shoulders. He was a man of 42, gaunt from years of meager parish meals and fervent prayer, his face etched with lines of quiet determination. Elias had come to this remote corner of rural England seeking solace after his wife's passing 5 years prior, but the village of Eldridge Hollow had its own shadows. Whispers among the flock spoke of unrest in the graves, of souls not resting as they should. He dismissed such talk as superstition, yet here he was, honoring a peculiar tradition, midnight confessions for those who could not speak in daylight. The clock in the nave struck the hour, its toll muffled by the storm outside. Elias rose, smoothing his black cassock, and stepped into the dimly lit sanctuary. The pews stood empty, their wood polished to a somber gleam by generations of penitents. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the altar, reds like fresh blood, blues like drowned skies. He knelt briefly, murmuring a prayer for guidance, then settled into the confessional booth, its carved oak panels worn smooth by countless hands. The first knock came softly, almost imagined, from the grill on the other side. Elias leaned forward, his voice steady. "Enter, child of God, and unburden your soul." The door creaked open, and a figure slipped in, cloaked in shadow. It was Widow Hargrove, or what remained of her, or so it seemed. Her face, pale as moonlight, bore the same kindly wrinkles he remembered from Sabbath services, but her eyes, they gleamed with an unnatural vacancy, like polished marbles in a porcelain doll. "Father Rawlins," she rasped, her voice a dry wind through brittle reeds, "I've come to confess what I could not in life." Elias's hand tightened on his rosary beads. Widow Hargrove had been buried 3 months past, felled by a fever that swept the hollow like a scythe. He had presided over her funeral, felt the weight of her plain oak coffin as it lowered into the earth. Yet here she sat, her shawl identical to the one she'd worn in her final days, frayed at the edges. He swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing calm into his tone. "Margaret, is this some jest? Speak plainly." But she only tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion that stirred the air with a faint, musty odor, like soil freshly turned. "No jest, Reverend. The ground, it holds us, but not forever. Listen, for the hour is short." Elias's mind raced, seeking rational anchors. Perhaps a prank by the village youths, or delirium from the storm's isolation. He had heard tales of grave robbers in nearby counties, but this was too precise, too hauntingly familiar. "If you're truly she," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "tell me something only Margaret Hargrove would know." Her lips parted in a smile that didn't reach those empty eyes. "The locket you buried with me, the one for my Henry. It holds a curl of his hair, dark as the night he left for the wars. You blessed it yourself, Father, before the soil claimed me." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through Elias's certainty. He had indeed seen that locket, silver and tarnished, clutched in her cold fingers at the graveside. A gust rattled the church doors, and Elias glanced toward the nave, half expecting to see the altar candles gutter out. But they held, their flames dancing mockingly. "What sin weighs upon you now?" he asked, his pulse quickening. Confession was his duty, even if this bordered on the profane. Widow Hargrove, or her echo, leaned closer to the grill, her breath fogging the wood with an icy mist. "Envy, Reverend. In life, I envied young Eliza Thorne's vitality, her laughter that echoed through the market. When the fever came, I whispered prayers not for mercy, but for her to burn with me. And now, she stirs below, as I do." Her fingers, pale and elongated, brushed the grill, leaving faint smears of dirt. Elias recoiled, the beads digging into his palm. Eliza Thorne was alive, wed just last spring, her cheeks still flushed with youth. This confession twisted like a thorn, implying a curse born of resentment. "The dead do not curse the living," he said firmly, though doubt crept in. "Return to your rest, Margaret. I absolve you." But she lingered, her form seeming to blur at the edges, as if the shadows claimed her piece by piece. "Absolution comes at a price, Father. The hollow hungers. More will come tonight." With that, she faded back through the door, leaving only the echo of her rasp and a scattering of grave soil on the booth floor. Elias sat frozen, the confessional suddenly claustrophobic. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing the windows like accusatory fingers. He rose unsteadily, stepping into the aisle, where the moonlight now pooled in unnatural shapes, vague outlines of hunched figures amid the pews. No one was there, yet the air thrummed with anticipation, as if the church itself awaited the next arrival. He returned to the vestry, barring the door with trembling hands, and lit another candle. The ledger lay open, and beside Margaret Hargrove's name, he noted the confession in his precise script. But as the wick burned low, a second knock echoed from the sanctuary, firmer this time, insistent. Elias closed his. The wind howled through the cracks in the rectory walls, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves from the churchyard. Reverend Elias Rawlins sat at his scarred oak desk, the single candle flame flickering as if alive with secrets. It was well past 11, and the village of Eldermore slept uneasily under a moonless sky. He had dismissed the last of his living flock hours ago, their confessions mundane sins of greed and gossip, but now the true vigil began. The clock on the mantel ticked relentlessly, each second a summons. Elias rubbed his eyes, weary from the day's sermons on redemption. At 42, he was a man of lean frame and sharp features, his black cassock hanging loose on shoulders bent by years of solitary prayer. The villagers called him steadfast, a rock against the superstitions that clung to these moors like fog, but tonight, doubt gnawed at him. The letter from old widow Hargrove, delivered by a trembling boy that afternoon, lay open before him. "Midnight, Father. They come for me. Hear my words before the end." She had been frail for months, bedridden with the wasting sickness, yet her script was steady, insistent. He glanced at the door to the nave, half expecting shadows to stir. The church was empty now, its pews silent witnesses to baptisms and burials alike. Elias had come to Eldermore 5 years prior, fleeing the scandals of a London parish where his questions about the afterlife had branded him unorthodox. Here, amid the peat bogs and ancient barrows, the dead were said to whisper on All Hallows' Eve, but he dismissed such tales as pagan remnants. Still, the custom had taken root in his bones, midnight confessions for those on the threshold, a rite he performed alone, or so he told himself. A low groan echoed from the vestibule, like the settling of old timbers, but Elias froze. It came again, closer, accompanied by the scrape of boots on stone. He rose slowly, heart quickening, and lit a second candle from the first. The flame steadied in his hand as he approached the door, the brass handle cold under his palm. "Who is there?" His voice was firm, though a tremor betrayed him. The door creaked open on its own, revealing not the empty corridor he expected, but a figure shrouded in mist that seemed to seep from the floorboards. Widow Hargrove stood, or hovered, before him, her form translucent in the candlelight, dressed in the white nightgown she had worn to her sickbed. Her face, once lined with laughter, was now gaunt, eyes hollow sockets reflecting no light. Yet she moved with purpose, gliding past him into the rectory without a sound. Elias staggered back, the candle nearly slipping from his grasp. "Mrs. Hargrove, this cannot be." His mind raced for explanations, a prank, a fever dream from his own exhaustion, but the chill that followed her was undeniable, frosting the air like winter's breath. She settled into the chair opposite his desk, her hands folding neatly in her lap, though they passed through the fabric without resistance. "Father Rawlins," she said, her voice a rasp like wind through dry reeds, "I come as promised. The hour is upon us. No accusation in her tone, only a weary finality that pierced him deeper than any scream. He sank into his seat, forcing his hands to steady on the desk. The Book of Common Prayer lay open to the confession rite, its pages untouched by the spectral cold. What must I hear? He whispered the words, clinging to ritual as his anchor. She leaned forward, the mist coiling around her like smoke. My sins, Father. The ones I buried with the child. Her eyes fixed on him, unblinking, and in that gaze, Elias saw not judgment, but a hunger for absolution that the living could never voice. The clock struck midnight, its chimes muffled, as if the night itself held its breath. The fog clung to the gravestones like a shroud, muting the moonlight into a sickly pallor that barely pierced the churchyard. Reverend Elias Rawlins stood at the edge of the burial ground, his breath fogging the chill air, the weight of his Bible a cold anchor in his hand. It was well past midnight now, the village of Eldridge Hollow silent save for the distant hoot of an owl. He had come here after the second confession, the one from Widow Hargrove, whose body lay stiff in her cottage not 2 hours before. Her voice had echoed in the empty chapel, thin and accusatory, spilling sins he never knew she harbored, affairs with the miller, a theft from the poor box. But her eyes, when he imagined them, were sightless, her skin already graying. Elias wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold, his cautious nature warring with the pull of duty. He was no brave soul, not like the missionaries in the tales he preached from the pulpit. He preferred the measured rhythm of sermons, the safe harbor of Scripture. Yet something compelled him back to the church each night, a whisper in his prayers that felt less like divine urging and more like a hook in his ribs. Tonight, he had barred the doors after Vespers, telling old Tom the sexton to go home early. Tom, with his wry squint and endless supply of skeptical quips, had lingered, muttering about foolish midnight vigils, before shuffling off. Elias envied Tom's earthbound cynicism now. The wind stirred the yew trees, their branches scraping against the stone wall like fingers on slate. He turned toward the chapel's side door, the one leading to the vestry where the first voice had come. It was unlatched, though he swore he'd secured it. Heart pounding in measured thuds, Elias pushed it open, the hinges groaning softly. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and candle wax, the single lantern he'd left flickering on the table casting long shadows that danced like specters. He set the Bible down and lit a second candle, its flame steadying his trembling fingers. Lord, guide me, he murmured, but the words tasted hollow. As the clock in the nave struck 1, a rustle came from the confessional booth at the far end of the chapel. Elias froze, his pulse quickening. The booth was a simple wooden partition, scarred from years of use, its curtain drawn as if waiting for a penitent. He approached slowly, each step echoing on the flagstones, his boots leaving faint mud prints. The curtain billowed slightly, though no draught stirred the room. "Who is there?" he called, his voice steadier than he felt, laced with the authority he reserved for wayward flock. A sigh answered, faint and ragged, like wind through cracked lungs. The curtain parted an inch, revealing nothing but darkness. Then, words slithered out, low and deliberate. "Father Rawlins. I've come to unburden." The voice belonged to Samuel Croft, the blacksmith whose forge had gone cold 3 days prior after a fever claimed him. Elias had presided over the hasty burial himself, the man's broad frame lowered into the earth with ropes that bit into calloused hands. Croft's wife had wept, insisting he'd been troubled in his final hours, muttering of debts unpaid. Elias gripped the edge of the booth, wood rough under his palms. "Samuel. This cannot be. You're at rest." But even as he spoke, doubt crept in, a cold tendril wrapping his spine. The voice continued, unhurried, confessing to sabotaging the miller's cart out of envy, to hoarding coin meant for the church roof while his children went shoeless. Each revelation landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Elias's mind, details too intimate, too damning to be invention. The flame in the lantern guttered, shadows leaping across the walls. Elias stepped back, his cautious mind screaming to flee, to summon Tom or the constable. But the voice pressed on, growing fainter, as if the speaker were receding into the earth. "Forgive me, Reverend. The weight, it pulls." A chill draft snaked through the booth, carrying the faint tang of iron and smoke, the scent of Croft's forge. Elias crossed himself, whispering absolution, his words tumbling out in a rush. The curtain fell still, the voice silenced, leaving only the drip of wax and his own ragged breathing. He stumbled from the chapel into the night, the fog thicker now, swallowing the path to the rectory. Tom's cottage light flickered in the distance, a beacon of normalcy, but Elias veered away, his thoughts churning. 2 nights, 2 dead souls seeking pardon, Hargrove and now Croft. What sin of his own had invited this? The village stirred uneasily in his mind, its secrets buried shallow. As he reached the rectory door, a shadow flitted at the edge of the yard, a figure, perhaps, or just the yews sway. He bolted inside, barring the door, but sleep evaded him, the confessions echoing like accusations in the dark. By dawn, he knew he could not face the pulpit alone. Tom would have to hear of this, skeptical quips be damned. The dead were rising, and their truths demanded more than midnight whispers. The lantern's flame flickered low in the sacristy, casting jagged shadows across the Reverend's worn desk. Elias Rawlins hunched over the ledger, his quill scratching out the night's confessions, whispers from souls that should have long passed into silence. Outside, the wind howled through the village spires, carrying the faint toll of the midnight bell from St. Agnes. It was the 4th night since the fever had claimed old widow Hargrove, and yet her voice lingered in his mind, confessing sins of envy that twisted like roots in his thoughts. He set the quill down, rubbing his temples. The air in the church felt thicker tonight, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something sharper, brimstone, perhaps, or just the imagined rot of the graveyard beyond the east window. Elias rose, his boots scuffing softly on the flagstones as he moved to the vestry door. He had barred it after the last visitor, but the knock came anyway, 3 deliberate raps, echoing like bones on wood. "Reverend?" The voice was muffled, belonging to Thomas Blackwood, the blacksmith whose hands were calloused from forge and grave digging alike. Elias hesitated, his cautious nature warring with the pull of duty. Thomas had buried 3 this week alone, his broad frame unbowed but his eyes hollowed by what he'd seen in the pits. Elias unlatched the door, peering into the gloom. Thomas stood there, hat in hand, his face pale under the moonlight slicing through the clouds. "It's young Mary, sir. The fever took her at dusk, but she's asking for you. At the edge of the green." Elias's breath caught. Mary Ellis, barely 16, with her quick laugh and nimble fingers for embroidery. She'd confessed to him once, tearfully, about a stolen ribbon, child's folly. Now, dead. The word sat ill in his mouth. "Lead on, Thomas. But mind the hour, the dead don't wait for dawn." They trudged through the village lanes, the mud sucking at their boots. Lantern held high, Elias scanned the shadows between the thatched cottages. The plague had come swift, a miasma from the river mists, claiming the weak first. Whispers spread of curses, of the river folk's old rites stirring something foul. Elias dismissed them as superstition, but tonight, with the air clinging cold to his skin, doubt crept in like fog. The green was a ragged patch of trampled grass, ringed by oaks that bent like supplicants in the gale. A small crowd huddled there, 5 souls, faces gaunt and flickering in the torchlight. Elias recognized them, the miller's wife, clutching her shawl, old Josiah, the tinker, with his pipe unlit, and the others, neighbors bound by shared grief. In the center, on a blanket spread hasty over the earth, lay Mary. Her chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, eyes half open, staring at nothing. "Reverend," the miller's wife murmured, stepping back as he approached. "She won't speak to us. Only calls your name." Elias knelt, the damp seeping through his knees. Mary's hand was cold as marble when he took it, her pulse a faint thread. "Child, it's Father Rawlins. What weighs on you?" Her lips parted, dry and cracked. The words came slow, a rasp that cut the wind. "The ribbon. I lied. It wasn't envy. I took it to bind the shadow. The one that follows from the water. Elias frowned, leaning closer. The crowd shifted uneasily. Thomas gripped his hammer tighter, as if expecting ghosts to rise. What shadow, Mary? Speak plain. Her eyes focused on him then, unnaturally clear. It comes at midnight. Whispers sins we buried. I confessed once, but it knows more. It took father first, then the babe. Reverend, it's in the confessions. Your book, it's feeding. A chill slithered down Elias's spine, sharper than the night air. His ledger, filled with the village's secrets, suddenly felt like a chain around his neck. He glanced at Thomas, whose face had drained of color. She's delirious, Elias said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mary's grip tightened, her nails digging in. Burn it, Reverend. Before it takes us all. The wind gusted, snuffing the nearest torch. In the sudden dark, Mary's breath hitched, a wet, final sound. The crowd gasped, Josiah muttering a prayer. Elias released her hand, standing abruptly. Her words echoed, a seed of dread planting deep. The shadow from the water, old tales of the river nymphs, drowned souls dragging the living down. He'd preached against such folly, but now. Thomas cleared his throat. What now, sir? The grave's dug, but. Elias stared at the body, still and small. We bury her at dawn. But tonight, we watch. He turned to the group, his voice steadying. No more confessions till light. Go home, all of you. Bar your doors. They dispersed reluctantly, shadows merging with shadows. Thomas lingered, his eyes on Elias. You believe her, don't you? About the book. Elias met his gaze, the weight of unspoken fears pressing in. I believe we test it. Come to the church at first light. We'll see what's fed by what. Alone now, Elias retraced his steps, the lantern swinging like a pendulum. The church loomed, its steeple a black finger against the stars. Inside, he bolted the door and approached the desk. The ledger lay open, pages whispering as he touched them. Mary's words clawed at him, it's feeding. He traced a line from last night's entry, Widow Hargrove's envy, confessed in the witching hour. Had her voice been her own, or something borrowed? A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias spun, heart pounding. The sacristy was empty, but the air hummed, thick with anticipation. Midnight had passed, yet the bell tolled once more, unbidden. From the nave, a soft shuffle echoed, like footsteps, hesitant, and the candle flame guttered in the draught seeping through the vestry window, casting Reverend Elias Rawlins's shadow long and wavering across the oak panels. It was the 5th night since the fever had claimed old Widow Hargrove, and yet her voice lingered in his mind like smoke that refused to dissipate. He had not slept properly since that first midnight confession, the one that came not from lips but from the chill air itself, whispering sins he had no right to hear from the departed. Elias rubbed his temples, the weight of the parish ledger heavy in his lap, its pages filled with names now crossed out in black ink: Hargrove, young Tomas the cooper's boy, and last night's visitor, Elias's own cousin, departed these 3 years but returned in spectral form to unburden a theft from the collection plate. He rose, joints protesting the damp of the parsonage, and peered out into the moonless yard. The village of Eldridge Hollow lay silent beyond the stone wall, its thatched roofs huddled like frightened sheep. No lanterns flickered in the windows, the living had learned to bar their doors at dusk, ever since the whispers began. Elias had tried to quell the rumors from the pulpit that Sunday, speaking of trials from the Almighty, but his voice had cracked on the words, for he knew the truth coiled deeper. The dead were not resting. They came to him, one by one, at the stroke of 12, their forms translucent as mist over the brook, eyes hollow but insistent. And with each confession, a piece of the veil thinned, revealing glimpses of the hollow's underbelly, a network of forgotten graves beneath the church foundations, disturbed perhaps by the recent flooding. A knock echoed from the nave, soft but deliberate, pulling him from his reverie. Elias's hand went to the silver cross at his throat, its edges worn smooth from years of anxious fingering. It could not be one of the living. They avoided him now, eyes averted in the market square, as if his proximity invited the grave's chill. He crossed the threshold into the dimly lit church, the air thick with the scent of incense and earth. There, by the altar rail, stood the figure of Margaret Poole, the schoolmistress who had drowned in the millpond a fortnight past. Her dress clung to her like sodden weeds, dripping spectral water that evaporated before touching the flagstones. "Elias," she murmured, her voice a rasp like wind through reeds. "Father Confessor, I come to you unbidden, for the weight presses." He swallowed, stepping closer despite the instinctive recoil in his gut. Margaret had been devout in life, her confessions always brief and penitent. But this was different. Her eyes, once bright with the fervor of teaching psalms to the village children, now gleamed with an unnatural sheen, reflecting nothing but the void. "Speak, child," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The Lord listens through me." She drifted nearer, the hem of her gown trailing wisps of fog. "It was not accident, the pond. I walked there knowing the current's hunger, for I had taken what was not mine." Her translucent fingers twisted together. "The letters, hidden in my cottage. They speak of the hollow secret, the pact our forebears made with the earth to keep the graves silent. But I read them, Elias, and envy stirred. I sought to wake one, to bargain for youth renewed." Elias's breath caught. The pact, he had heard whispers of it as a boy, dismissed as tavern tales of Eldridge's founding, when settlers buried their dead with offerings to appease some ancient malice in the soil. But Margaret's words stirred the memory of his own midnight vigils, the way the ground beneath the church seemed to hum with unrest. "What have you done?" he asked, though dread already coiled in his chest. "I whispered the invocation from the letters," she confessed, her form flickering like a candle in gusts. "But it called more than I bargained. Now they rise, not just to confess, but to claim. The dead hunger for the living secrets, Elias, and you are the door." A chill wind stirred the altar cloths, extinguishing two of the vigil candles. Shadows lengthened, and in the nave's corners, Elias glimpsed faint outlines, other forms, hovering just beyond sight, their murmurs a low chorus building like distant thunder. Margaret's image began to fade, dissolving into motes that danced in the air. "Absolve me," she pleaded, her voice thinning to a sigh. "Before they all come through." "In nomine Patris," Elias began, his hands trembling as he traced the sign of the cross over the empty space. The words felt hollow, a frail barrier against the encroaching dark. As her essence dissipated, the church bells tolled midnight from the tower, each peal vibrating through his bones. He was alone now, or so he told himself, but the air grew heavier, laden with the scent of turned soil and decay. Footsteps echoed from the shadows, soft, insistent, not from boots but from bare feet long interred. Elias backed toward the vestry, heart pounding. The ledger slipped from his grasp, pages fluttering open to reveal not just names, but hastily scrawled notes from prior confessions, thefts, betrayals, and worse, hints of a ritual gone awry in 1792, when the village elders had sealed something beneath the foundations. He snatched it up, clutching it like a shield, and barred the vestry door. But the scratching began almost immediately, faint at first, like nails on wood from within the walls themselves. By dawn's first gray light, Elias had not slept. He sat at his desk, quill in hand, composing a letter to the bishop in the distant city, a plea for aid, for exorcism, anything to stem the tide. But even as he wrote, he knew the post would not reach far. The roads out of the hollow grew treacherous, mired in unnatural fogs that swallowed travelers. And worse, a new name burned in his mind, his own sister's, lost to childbirth 5 years gone. Would she come tonight? Her confessions laced. Reverend Elias Rawlins sat in the dim vestry, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and extinguished candles. The clock on the mantel ticked past the 11th hour, its brass hands gleaming faintly in the moonlight that slanted through the narrow window. He had barred the doors of the church earlier that evening, telling himself it was to ward off the chill wind howling from the moors, but deep down he knew it was fear, raw, gnawing fear, that kept him isolated in this stone sanctuary. The first confession had come 3 nights prior, from Widow Hargrove, who arrived at the stroke of midnight with soil caked on her hem and a pallor that made her eyes sink into shadows. She had whispered of a bargain struck in her youth, a pact with something ancient beneath the old barrow on the hill, and by dawn she was found cold in her bed, the village doctor muttering of heart failure. Rawlins had burned her words in the grate, but they lingered, etched into his mind like frost on glass. Tonight, he waited for no one. Or so he told himself. The parish ledger lay open before him, its pages listing the living and the lost, but his hand trembled as he traced the name of Thomas Blackwood, the miller who had vanished 2 weeks past during a storm. Rumors swirled in the alehouse, drowned in the river, taken by wolves, or worse, called away by the dead who walked the fog-shrouded paths. A knock echoed through the church, soft as a breath, yet it jolted Rawlins from his chair. He froze, heart pounding against his ribs. The doors were locked, he had checked them himself. Another knock, firmer this time, reverberated from the vestry door itself. His mouth went dry. "Who is there?" he called, his voice cracking like thin ice. No answer. Only the wind rattling the panes. He approached the door, fingers hovering over the latch, the wood cool and unyielding beneath his palm. With a deep breath, he turned it, pulling the door open to the empty nave. Moonlight pooled on the flagstones, casting long shadows from the pews. Nothing stirred. He stepped out, the hem of his cassock brushing the cold floor, and scanned the silence. Then, from the chancel, a figure emerged. It was Eliza Thorne, the young seamstress who had sewn altar cloths for him last Easter. Her dress hung loose on her frame, as if she had wasted away in secret, and her bare feet left no mark on the stone. "Father Rawlins," she said, her voice a hollow echo, "I come to confess." He recoiled, pressing a hand to the crucifix at his throat. Eliza had been vital, her laughter bright in the Sunday gatherings, but this apparition, her skin translucent, veins like rivers of ink beneath, bore only a faint resemblance. "Eliza? But you, the fever took you last Michaelmas. Buried in the churchyard." She glided closer, her eyes fixed on some point beyond him, unblinking. "The fever was mercy. The truth burns hotter." She knelt before the altar rail, folding her hands as if in prayer, but her fingers twisted unnaturally, joints bending backward. Rawlins forced himself to approach, his legs leaden, whispering a litany under his breath to steady his soul. "Sin clings like burrs," she began, her words unraveling slowly, each one pulling at the air between them. "I stole from the collection plate, not for bread, but to buy silence from the man who knew my shame. He came to me in dreams after, his face rotting, demanding repayment in blood." Her gaze lifted then, locking onto Rawlins's, and he saw the void within, endless, hungry. "The dead do not forget, Father. They whisper through the roots, through the water, calling us back to settle debts." Rawlins's throat tightened. He wanted to flee, to bolt the doors and pretend this was delirium from lack of sleep, but duty anchored him. "What must you do to be absolved?" he asked, the ritual words tasting like ash. She smiled, a crack in porcelain, revealing teeth too sharp. "Absolution? There is none. Only the sharing. Listen, and carry it." Her voice dropped to a murmur, recounting nights of hidden trysts and a child buried unmarked in the woods, the father's rage turning to a curse that bound her spirit to the earth. With each revelation, the shadows in the nave deepened, coiling like smoke around the pillars. Rawlins felt it then, a pressure building in his chest, as if her words were stones piling upon him. When she finished, Eliza rose without a sound, her form flickering like candle flame. "Your turn will come, Reverend. The midnight bell tolls for all." She turned toward the shadows, dissolving into mist that seeped through the cracks in the stone floor. Rawlins collapsed onto a pew, gasping, his mind reeling with the weight of her unburdened sin now lodged in him. Outside, the wind howled louder, carrying faint cries from the moors, voices, perhaps, or the echo of his own unraveling resolve. He knew sleep would not come tonight, the dead had claimed another vigil. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as he stared at the ledger, he wondered whose name would summon him next. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught seeping through the vestry window, casting jagged shadows across the Reverend Elias Rawlins' face. He sat hunched at his scarred oak desk, the weight of the night's vigil pressing into his bones like the chill of the autumn rain outside. It was past 2 in the morning, and the parish house creaked under the assault of the storm, but sleep eluded him. The confessions lingered in his mind, not as words, but as echoes, whispers from beyond the grave that clawed at the edges of his sanity. He had lit the lantern after the third figure departed, or rather, dissolved into the mist that coiled through the cracked door. Mrs. Harrow, the baker's widow, her skin pale as chapel wax, had knelt before him with eyes that held no reflection. "Father," she had murmured, her voice a rasp like wind through dry leaves, "I poisoned the well in 32, for the child that wasn't mine." And then, as abruptly as she appeared, she was gone, leaving only the scent of damp earth and regret. Rawlins rubbed his temples, the inkwell's quill still clutched in his fist, its tip stained with hurried notes he dared not reread. A knock echoed from the front door, 3 slow raps, deliberate, like the tolling of a muffled bell. Rawlins froze, his heart stuttering in his chest. The clock on the mantel confirmed the hour. No living soul in Eldridge Hollow stirred at this time, not with the fever claiming souls by the dozen. He rose, the floorboards groaning under his boots, and approached the door with the caution of a man who had begun to question the boundary between the quick and the dead. Peering through the iron latch's slit, he saw nothing but the rain-slicked path, the gravestones in the yard blurred by sheets of water. Yet the knock came again, insistent, vibrating through the wood. Rawlins unbolted the door, swinging it open to the storm's fury. Wind howled in, snuffing the lantern's flame, and there, on the threshold, stood Thomas Greer, the miller whose funeral Rawlins had presided over not a fortnight past. Greer's form was unmistakable, the broad shoulders that once hauled sacks of flour, the hands calloused and scarred from the grindstone. But his eyes were voids, dark pools that drank in the scant moonlight, and his clothes hung sodden, as if pulled from the river that had claimed him. Water dripped from his sleeves in steady rivulets, pooling at his feet without soaking the floorboards. "Reverend," he said, the word emerging not from his mouth but from the air around him, a hollow timbre that raised the hairs on Rawlins' neck. "I come to confess." Rawlins stepped back, his mouth dry as ash. He had prepared himself, or so he thought, after the others, the blacksmith with his tale of stolen tithes, the seamstress who admitted to smothering her debts with lies. But Greer was different, his death had been violent, the mill wheel snagging his coat, dragging him under. The parish whispered of accident, but Rawlins had seen the bruises on the widow's arms, heard the arguments that echoed from the mill at dusk. "Enter," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt, gesturing to the confessional alcove in the hall. Greer moved without sound, his boots leaving no print on the rug. He knelt in the shadowed booth, the wooden kneeler creaking faintly under an impossible weight. Rawlins took his place opposite, the lattice screen between them a frail barrier against the unnatural. The rain drummed on the roof, a relentless percussion that masked the world outside. "Speak your sins, my son," Rawlins intoned, the ritual words a lifeline to normalcy. The confession unfolded in fragments, Greer's voice weaving through the gloom like smoke. He spoke of envy first, how he had sabotaged rival mills in the county, salting their gears with grit until they ground to halt. Then deeper sins, the nights he struck his wife for imagined slights, the coins he skimmed from the parish poor box to drown his guilts in ale. Each word carried a chill, frosting the air in the booth, and Rawlins felt it settle in his lungs, a tightness that made breathing labored. But it was the final revelation that pierced him. "The child," Greer whispered, his form leaning closer to the screen, close enough that Rawlins could smell the rot of the riverbed on him. "Not mine, but I let it be born in shame. Pushed her down the stairs when she begged to leave. The fall, it took them both. The widow's bruises, the unexplained miscarriage, suddenly, the pieces aligned in Rawlins' mind, a mosaic of horror he had overlooked in his pastoral duties. Rawlins gripped the edge of the booth, his knuckles whitening. "And now?" he asked, the question slipping out unbidden, "a breach in the confessional seal." Greer's laugh was a wet gurgle, echoing unnaturally. "Now the dead walk to unburden, Reverend. But some weights drag others down." The figure rose then, the booth shuddering as if from an unseen force. Through the lattice, Rawlins saw Greer's hand extend, not in benediction, but clawing, the nails black with mud from the grave. Panic surged, and Rawlins stumbled back, knocking over the lantern that had reignited itself on the floor. Flames licked at the rug, but they cast Greer's face in stark relief, not anger, but hunger, a void that yearned to fill itself with the living. The door to the confessional burst open, and Greer lunged, his grasp closing around Rawlins' wrist like iron manacles forged in the abyss. Rawlins wrenched free, the skin burning where touch met flesh, and bolted for the vestry. He slammed the door behind him, barricading it with his desk as Greer's form hammered against the wood, each blow reverberating through the house like thunder. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the true tempest brewed, a pastor cornered by the sins he had unwittingly. The fog clung to the graveyard stones like a shroud unwilling to lift, and Reverend Rawlins felt its chill seep through the wool of his coat as he knelt beside the fresh mound of earth. It had been Eliza Thorne's grave, dug just 2 nights prior after the fever claimed her in the dead of afternoon. The villagers whispered of contagion, but Rawlins knew better now, or at least, he suspected. The confessions had grown bolder, the apparitions more insistent, pulling him from his rectory bed with whispers that echoed like wine through cracked bells. Tonight, he had come prepared, a small iron lantern at his feet casting jagged shadows, and in his pocket, the silver crucifix his mother had pressed into his hand before her own passing. He waited, breath fogging the air, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl slicing the silence. The plan was simple, born of desperation after the last visitation: confront the spirit not with prayers alone, but with questions. Who, or what, bound them to this midnight ritual? Rawlins had pored over the parish ledgers by candlelight, tracing patterns in the deaths: old Farmer Hale, the baker's widow, now Eliza, all confessing sins long buried, sins that twisted like roots beneath the village's pious facade. If he could unravel one thread, perhaps the apparitions would cease, sparing him the torment of bearing their unseen burdens. A rustle stirred the mist, faint at first, like leaves skittering across frozen ground. Rawlins rose slowly, his knees protesting the damp cold, and gripped the crucifix tighter. The air thickened, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something sweeter, like overripe apples fermenting in the dark. Eliza emerged from the fog not as a specter of bone and haze, but solid as the living, her nightgown muddied at the hem, eyes wide and unblinking in the lantern's glow. She was younger in death, her cheeks flushed as if from a brisk walk, not the wasting sickness that had hollowed her out. "Reverend," she murmured, voice a threadbare whisper that cut through the night. "I've come again. The weight, it presses." Rawlins stepped forward, heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. "Eliza, wait. Before you speak your sins, tell me why. Why midnight? Why me?" He held out the crucifix, not as a ward but a bridge, its metal warm in his palm despite the frost. She tilted her head, shadows playing across her face like fingers tracing a map. For a moment, silence held, broken only by the lantern's flicker. Then she smiled, a small, sorrowful curve that didn't reach her eyes. "The bell tolls at 12, Reverend. It calls us when the veil thins. But you listen. The others turn away." He pressed on, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "What binds you? Is it judgment? Or something earthly?" The words felt clumsy in the open air, but he needed answers, not another litany of village secrets, adulteries, thefts, envies that paled against the horror of their return. Eliza's form shimmered then, edges blurring as if the fog sought to reclaim her. "Earthly, yes. The soil remembers. Dig, Reverend. Beneath the yew tree, where the old chapel stood before the fire." Her gaze drifted to the far edge of the graveyard, where the ancient yew loomed, its branches gnarled like accusing fingers. But hurry. The others wait. They hunger for release. Before he could respond, she dissolved into mist, the sweet scent lingering like a promise, or a warning. Rawlins stood frozen, the crucifix now cold as the grave. Dig? The notion clawed at him, absurd in the rational light of day, but here, under the moon's pale scrutiny, it carried the weight of inevitability. He glanced at the spade leaning against a nearby stone, borrowed from the sexton's shed under pretense of tending the plots. The plan had been to question, not to unearth, but her words echoed, pulling him toward the yew. The ground there was harder, roots interlacing like veins, and Rawlins' shovel bit shallow at first, each strike sending jolts up his arms. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill, and he paused to wipe it away, the lantern hooked on a low branch casting his shadow long and distorted. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the owl's calls growing frantic. Then the blade struck something unyielding, not stone, but wood, splintered and dark with age. He dropped to his knees, prying at the earth with bare hands, dirt caking under his nails. The wood gave way to a small box, no larger than a Bible, its lid etched with faded symbols, crosses intertwined with thorns. Heart racing, Rawlins lifted it free, the weight surprising, as if it held more than relics. Inside, nestled in rotted cloth, lay a cluster of bones, tiny and fragile, fingers curled as in eternal grasp, and beside them, a tarnished locket bearing the initials E.T., Eliza Thorns, but from a time before her birth. A low moan rose from the soil, not from the box but the ground itself, vibrating through his bones. Rawlins recoiled, the lantern tipping, spilling light across the unearthed hollow. Shadows writhed within, coalescing into forms, half-seen faces, mouths opening in silent pleas. The apparitions weren't waiting for midnight anymore, they were here, drawn by the disturbance, their presences pressing against him like a tide. He scrambled back, clutching the box to his chest, but the moans swelled into cries, echoing from every grave. The yew's branches swayed without wind, leaves whispering accusations. Rawlins fled toward the rectory gate, the weight in his arms growing heavier with each step, as if the dead clung to their prize. Behind him, the graveyard stirred, the fog thickening into something alive, pursuing. By the time he barred the rectory door, breath ragged, the cries had faded to murmurs outside the walls. But the box sat on his desk, unopened fully, its contents a riddle that Reverend Rawlins gripped the iron latch of the crypt door, his fingers numb from the midnight chill that seeped through the stone walls of St. Agnes. The air down here hung heavy, laced with the faint rot of earth and forgotten bones, but tonight it carried something sharper, a whisper that wasn't wind. He had come alone this time, leaving Eliza and the boy at the vicarage, their warnings echoing in his mind like half-remembered scripture. "The dead don't confess, Elias," she'd said, her eyes hollowed by the lantern's flicker. But they did. Oh, they did. The door creaked open on hinges rusted by decades of disuse, revealing the narrow chamber where the parish's oldest markers leaned like weary sentinels. Moonlight slanted through a high grate, painting silver veins across the flagstones. Rawlins stepped inside, his boots scraping softly, and knelt before the low slab etched with the name of Margaret Hale, died 1827, faithful wife and mother. It was her voice that had called him in his dreams these past nights, not pleading, but insistent, as if the grave could no longer contain her unfinished words. He lit the single candle he'd brought, its flame dancing uncertainly against the damp. "Margaret," he murmured, the word tasting of ash on his tongue. "If you're here, speak. The Lord listens through me." Silence answered first, thick and mocking, broken only by the distant toll of the church bell marking the hour. Then, a sigh, soft as silk tearing, rose from the slab. The candle guttered, but did not go out. "Elias," the voice came, not from the stone, but from the shadows pooling at his feet. It was her voice, laced with the tremor of life long faded, yet clear as the confessions he'd heard from the living pews. "You came. I thought the fear would keep you away." Rawlins's breath caught, he pressed his palms to the cold floor, steadying himself. Margaret Hale had been a quiet soul, her sins petty, gossip over tea, a hidden resentment toward her husband's wanderings. But now, her tone held no pettiness, only a weight that pressed against his chest. "Tell me," he urged, his voice steadier than he felt. "Unburden yourself before the dawn." The shadows shifted, coalescing into a vague form at the slab's edge, pale hands folding as if in prayer, though no flesh met his eyes. "It wasn't the fever that took me," she began, words spilling like water from a cracked ewer. "It was the bargain. In 25, when the blight came and the crops withered, I went to the crossroads at dusk. Old Widow Thorne had whispered of it, a pact with the wanderer who treads the vale. 'Just a drop of blood,' she said, 'for full silos come harvest.'" Rawlins's pulse quickened, the crypt seemed to narrow, walls inching closer. He'd heard tales of such things, dismissed them as fevered folly, but here in the dark, they rooted deep. "And you paid?" he asked, though the answer hung already in the air. The form nodded, a ripple in the gloom. "The grain grew tall that year, golden as promised. But the wanderer came back, night after night, demanding more. Not blood, but truths, the ones I'd buried deeper than this stone. I confessed to him, Elias, all the lies to my husband, the envy of my neighbors. He took them, and with each one, a piece of me faded. By the end, I was hollow, and the fever was his mercy." The candle flame stretched tall, casting her shadow long across the chamber, a silhouette of a woman bowed, but unbroken. Rawlins swallowed, his throat dry. "Why now? Why me?" The voice softened, almost tender. "Because you're next, Reverend. The wanderer hears your doubts, the sermons you preach with a hollow heart, the nights you lie awake questioning the flock's blind faith. He's at your door already, waiting for midnight's toll." A chill wind snaked through the grate, extinguishing the candle in a puff of smoke. In the sudden black, Rawlins fumbled for his matches, heart hammering against his ribs. The voice lingered, fading like mist. "Confess, Elias. Or join us before your time." He struck the match, the spark blooming brief and fierce, revealing nothing but empty stone. Yet as he rose, trembling, the crypt door stood ajar, though he swore he'd latched it tight. Outside, the churchyard waited, fog curling like fingers around the gravestones. Rawlins hurried toward the vicarage, the weight of Margaret's words clinging heavier than the night's damp. Eliza would be pacing, the boy feigning sleep, but he couldn't tell them yet. Not until he faced what stirred in the shadows of his own soul. The bell tolled once more, deeper now, as if counting his steps toward dawn, or damnation. The wind howled through the cracked panes of the rectory window, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. Reverend Elias Rawlins sat hunched over his desk, the candle's flame flickering like a dying pulse. His hands, gnarled from years of gripping the pulpit, trembled as he clutched the worn leather journal. The entries blurred before his eyes, not from fatigue, but from the weight of what they revealed. Last night's confession from Widow Hargrove's shade had unraveled him, her whispers of buried sins echoed in his skull, demanding he confront the one truth he'd evaded since the apparitions began. A soft knock rattled the door, too deliberate for the storm outside. Elias froze, his breath catching. It couldn't be Thomas, his young curate, who had stormed out hours earlier, vowing never to return after witnessing the third spectral visitor. No, this was something else, something that slithered from the graveyard's embrace. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking under his boots, and approached the door. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the room itself were exhaling frost. Opening it revealed nothing but swirling mist and the silhouette of the old oak tree, its branches clawing at the sky. Yet the knock came again, from within the threshold. Elias's heart pounded, a drumbeat against his ribs. He stepped back, murmuring a prayer that felt hollow on his tongue. Then, from the shadows of the hallway, she emerged, Mary Poole, the miller's daughter, dead these 5 years from fever. Her form was translucent, the moonlight piercing her like paper, but her eyes burned with a clarity that pinned him in place. "Father," she said, her voice a rustle of dry leaves, "I've come for absolution. The hour is upon us. Elias nodded mechanically, gesturing to the confessional chair by the fire. He had built no booth. These midnight rites unfolded in the open, where the dead could not hide their forms. As she settled, the flames dimmed, casting her face in hollow relief, cheeks sunken, lips pale, yet her gaze held the fire of the living. He knelt opposite her, the floor biting into his knees. "Speak your sins, child. The Lord listens through me." Mary leaned forward, her fingers, ethereal wisps, twining in her lap. It was the night of the harvest fair. "I stole the locket from Eliza's neck, the one with her mother's hair inside. Jealousy, Father. It burned in me like the fever that took me. I hid it in the riverbed, under the weeping willow. But death hasn't washed it clean. It pulls at me, that theft, tethering my soul." Elias swallowed, the journal's pages whispering accusations in his mind. Mary's story wove into the others, thefts, betrayals, secrets that bound the dead to this forsaken parish. But tonight, her words stirred something deeper, a pattern he could no longer ignore. The apparitions weren't random, they sought him because he, too, harbored a sin unspoken, one that fed their unrest. His hand drifted to the desk drawer, where the tarnished locket lay, unearthed from the river just yesterday by his own reluctant hands. As Mary continued, her voice gaining urgency, Elias felt the room tilt. Shadows lengthened, creeping across the walls like ink spilled from an unseen bottle. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," she intoned, but her eyes locked on his, unblinking. "And you, have you not sinned in silence? The confessions pile like stones on your chest. Release them, or join us in the endless night." He recoiled, the chair scraping back. The fire sputtered out entirely, plunging them into gloom broken only by the moon's sickly glow. Mary's form flickered, edges fraying like smoke, but she reached out, her touch a chill that seeped into his bones. "The locket," she hissed. "It calls to all of us. Yours is the hand that must break the chain." Elias stumbled to his feet, fumbling for the drawer. The metal was cold against his palm as he withdrew the locket, its clasp rusted shut. Memories flooded him, not Mary's theft, but his own complicity, years ago, when as a younger man he'd witnessed the miller's rage and done nothing as the family fractured. The sin of omission, the one that had drawn these spirits to his door. With a ragged breath, he pried it open, the hair inside brittle and dark. Mary's shade watched, her form stabilizing for a moment, a faint smile ghosting her lips. But as the wind battered the windows anew, Elias sensed the approach of others, faint murmurs rising from the floorboards, like roots stirring beneath the soil. The night was far from over, her confession was but a thread in the unraveling tapestry. He must face the heart of it now, before the dead claimed their confessor entire. Reverend Rawlins gripped the edge of the confessional's worn oak panel, his knuckles widening as the midnight bell tolled its final, hollow note from the tower above. The air in the church had thickened since the last confession, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something sharper, decay, perhaps, or the metallic tang of fierce sweat from his own brow. Elias, the only living soul he trusted with fragments of this madness, stood vigil outside the booth, his lantern casting jittery shadows that danced like specters across the nave. But Elias's breaths came ragged now, too close, too urgent, as if the young man's caution had finally cracked under the weight of what they'd unearthed. The grate before Rawlins rattled faintly, unbidden, and he leaned in, his ear pressing against the cold lattice. No voice came at first, only a low rasp, like wind scraping over dry leaves. Then, clearer, "Father, the miller's wife. She whispers still, from the riverbed where I left her." It was Thomas Hale's voice, the blacksmith, dead these 3 weeks from a fever that had twisted his lungs into knots. Rawlins had buried him himself, under a sky bruised with storm clouds. Yet here it was, Hale's gravelly timbre, laced with a desperation that clawed at the priest's resolve. "I hear you, Thomas," Rawlins murmured, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. He had learned, over these cursed midnights, not to question the how or why, not yet. The confessions poured forth like blood from an old wound, Hale's admission of drowning the miller's wife in a fit of jealous rage, her pleas bubbling up from the water like accusations from the grave. Rawlins's hand trembled as he traced the sign of the cross in the air, but the words kept coming, each one heavier, pulling at the threads of sanity he'd woven so carefully these past months. Outside, Elias shifted, his boots scraping the flagstones. "Reverend," he hissed through the curtain. "It's growing, louder. The others, they're stirring in the pews." Rawlins glanced through the slit in the booth. The church, empty save for dust motes in the lantern light, seemed to pulse now, the wooden benches creaking as if burdened by invisible weights. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, coiling toward the altar like smoke from a hidden fire. Elias's face, pale and drawn, hovered at the edge of the light. Brave Elias, who had once scoffed at ghost stories, now clutching a rosary as if it were a weapon. "Hold fast," Rawlins whispered back, but his own faith wavered as Hale's confession twisted into something darker. "She rises with the fog, Father. Every dawn, her fingers break the surface, reaching for me. I feel them now, cold on my neck." The grate grew icy under Rawlins's palm, frost blooming across the wood in fractal patterns. He pulled away, heart pounding, as a chill seeped through his cassock, numbing his skin. This was no mere echo of guilt, it was Hale's essence, unbound and hungry, dragging the priest into the mire of the dead's unrest. Elias burst through the curtain then, his eyes wild. "They're here, the parishioners. Not shadows, Reverend. Faces. In the glass of the windows, in the cracks of the walls." He pointed, and Rawlins followed his gaze. The stained glass saints leered down, their colors bleeding into grotesque masks, eyes hollow and accusatory. A murmur rose from the emptiness, a chorus of half-formed pleas: Widow Jenkins, the poacher's son, the baker with his poisoned loaves, all clamoring for absolution that Rawlins could no longer grant without cost. Rawlins rose, his legs unsteady, and clasped Elias's shoulder. "The crypt," he said, the word tasting of iron. "We go below. The root of this, it festers there." Elias nodded, though fear etched lines into his youthful face, and together they moved toward the altar, the confessions trailing them like a shroud. Behind the heavy iron grate of the crypt door, something stirred, a deeper rasp, not of one voice, but many, converging on the midnight hour's end. Rawlins's key turned in the lock with a groan, and as the door swung open, the cold rushed up like a tide, promising revelations that might drown them both. The candle flame guttered in the vestry, casting shadows that clawed at the walls like the fingers of the unquiet dead. Reverend Elias Rawlins sat slumped in his chair, his once steady hands trembling as he clutched the worn leather journal. The midnight bell had tolled an hour past, its echo still vibrating in his bones, but the confessions had not ceased. They never did any more. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and extinguished hope, the kind that seeped from open graves. He had burned the first entries weeks ago, convinced it was a fever dream born of his isolation in this forsaken parish. But the voices returned, whispering through the floorboards, pulling him back to the confessional at the stroke of 12. Tonight, they were louder, more insistent. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, his collar chafing like a noose. "Lord, forgive me," he murmured, though the words tasted like ash. The journal's pages, filled with scrawled admissions from souls long buried, adultery in the miller's loft, poison in the squire's tea, infanticide under the harvest moon, seemed to pulse under his fingers. A soft knock echoed from the church door, deliberate, unhurried. Elias froze. It couldn't be Widow Hargrove again. Her spectre had faded after he unearthed her locket from the churchyard soil, returning it to the grave with prayers that bought him 3 nights' peace. No, this was different. He rose, joints protesting, and crossed the nave, the wooden floor creaking like old bones settling. Moonlight sliced through the stained glass windows, painting the pews in fractured reds and blues, as if the saints themselves bled judgment. Opening the door revealed nothing at first, just the fog rolling in from the marshes, swallowing the tombstones whole. Then, a figure emerged from the mist, cloaked in tattered wool, face obscured by a hood. Elias's breath caught. Who who seeks absolution at this hour? His voice cracked, brave facade crumbling. The figure stepped forward, and the hood fell back, revealing not a stranger, but Thomas, his own reflection from youth, wide-eyed, fervent, the boy who had entered the seminary with dreams of saving souls. But Thomas was dead. Drowned in the river 20 years past, body never recovered, his ghost a tale the villagers told to scare children. "Father," the apparition said, voice a hollow echo, "I've come to confess what you buried in me." Elias staggered back, the door slamming shut behind them. The church filled with a chill that frosted the breath in his lungs. Thomas advanced, his form flickering like candlelight on water, eyes hollow pits that mirrored Elias's growing dread. "You remember the night of the storm," Thomas continued, his words weaving through the air like smoke. "The parishioners gathered, seeking shelter, but you turned them away. Said the church was for the living faithful, not the desperate. I followed them into the flood, trying to save what you condemned." Elias's mind reeled, fragments of memory surfacing, the rising waters, the cries swallowed by thunder, the guilt he had drowned in sermons and solitude. He had told himself it was God's will, but now the dead returned it to him, one confession at a time. The spectre reached out, cold fingers brushing Elias's sleeve, and visions flooded in, the miller's wife gasping her last in the current, the squire's children clutching at branches that snapped like promises. "Their sins were yours too," Thomas whispered. "You hoarded the light, left us to the dark." Elias collapsed against the altar, the journal tumbling open to a blank page that began to fill itself with ink-black script, his own unspoken failures, the bribes from the Lord to overlook poaching, the nights he ignored the cries of the poor. Panic surged, but beneath it, a spark of the cautious faith that had sustained him. He couldn't run, the dead had claimed the parish, their unrest a tide he had unwittingly unleashed by his neglect. Grasping the crucifix from the altar, its silver cool against his palm, Elias straightened. "Then confess it all," he said, voice steadying. "Not to me, but to him who waits beyond." He thrust the crucifix forward, not as a weapon, but an offering, reciting the absolution rite with a fervor born of desperation. Thomas halted, form wavering. The church trembled, pews rattling as if the foundations shifted, and whispers rose from the shadows, dozens of voices, the parishioners he had failed, their confessions merging into a chorus of release. One by one, they faded, drawn into the light that bloomed from the crucifix, not blinding, but gentle, like dawn over the marshes. Thomas lingered last, his eyes softening. "Forgive yourself, Elias. The dead rest easier when the living do." Silence fell, profound and empty. Elias sank to his knees, the journal crumbling to dust in his hands, its words scattered like leaves in the wind. Dawn crept through the windows, gilding the nave in gold. The church felt lighter, the air clean, but as he rose, a faint chill lingered in his chest, a reminder that some graves, once opened, left their mark. He would preach that morning, not of judgment, but of mercy, knowing the midnight bell might toll again, softer now, a call to vigilance rather than dread. The parish stirred outside, life resuming its fragile rhythm, but Elias carried the weight of the night, a guardian forever changed.